For today's talk, I will read from a letter received from someone with whom I've been in correspondence. The woman has multiple sclerosis. And she's asked for tapes. So this is her letter is in response to one of the tapes. And the tape was on pain and suffering. It also happened that after the last retreat, one of the participants lent me a book. This is the second book by Etty Hillesum, Letters from Westerbork. She's the author of An Interrupted Life. We had 2 readings a while ago. And I've picked some selections from this book, because somehow it seems to go with this letter. Here's what she writes. It is excerpted, what I'm reading. One tape in particular, Pain and Suffering, has helped me to radically change the way I view this ongoing struggle with health problems, which has intensified since I first wrote you. The heat in the summer makes multiple sclerosis much worse, and I've had an especially hard time walking, getting to work, and doing anything physical at all in the last 3 weeks. In desperation, I became willing to question my predicament and my way of defining it deeply. And the Pain and Suffering tape arrived at just the right time to help me do this. After days of questioning, I've had a number of fresh insights that feel remarkable to me. Although these insights may change in the light of new or deepened understanding, they feel very strong to me now, as if someone turned a light on somewhere. I'd like to share some of these discoveries with you. I've previously defined this multiple sclerosis as a gift in quotation marks, in an attempt to give meaning to suffering and thereby make it more bearable. It's clear to me now that this was false seeing. I've been attached to the sadness and tragedy, in quotation marks, of the continuing loss of my bodily functions, and have been reluctant to let these feelings go, because they've given a meaning to pain. I can now see that this is not reality either. I've made a project out of transcending pain in order to escape from it. Doing this no longer makes sense to me in light of new understanding. I can't lessen the suffering of others through my own suffering, or attempt in this way to give meaning to suffering. And I don't want to anymore. I can see that pain is not to be overcome, in quotation marks, because that just creates more separation and therefore more pain. I can see that pain and suffering are 2 different things. Pain is pain, and suffering is pain with something added. There's no meaning or need for any in suffering. There is no merit or lack of merit in suffering. There is no my suffering or my pain. There's just suffering and pain. suffering is caused by separation from pain. Here she makes 5 exclamation marks and underlines it. Suffering is caused by separation from pain. And anyone who has observed what goes on when there's pain understands what she's talking about. The immediate resistance to the pain, the feeling, why do I have that? Why do I have this and others go without it? How can I get rid of it? I must get rid of it. I must overcome it. All this is separation. It's the thought that separates. The thought of an I, a me, that suffers that, as though there was a duality in oneself, the me and what it suffers. In truth, there's only what is. And when that is not defined and known and reacted to, it isn't the pain that one knows. It has nothing to do with knowing. The only relief from pain comes from not being separated from it, by experiencing the pure sensation of what is. While pain can be relieved, but not always ended, suffering can be ended completely. Suffering ends when I'm not separate from pain, and there's therefore no me to suffer. The relationship of suffering to compassion and despair is that when I stop suffering, there is no despair. And when I have no despair, I am free to experience compassion. As I'm putting these insights to work in my daily life, the suffering which I thought of as my suffering has lessened, and the pain which I thought of as my pain has become more bearable. There's a PS to this letter later on. Toni, I thought of a question. While I'm clear on the difference between pain and suffering, I've noticed that sometimes in the area of emotional pain, it's hard to tell where the pain ends and the suffering begins. Emotional pain seems by definition to be complicated, quite the way suffering is. I hope my question makes sense. I don't know how to make it more clear. Thank you for your help. The question being, where does the emotional pain end and the suffering begin? Suffering from emotional pain. What is emotional pain? What does one refer to when one uses the words emotional pain? Is it the sheer physiological, organismic pain of anger, or anxiety and fear? The pain of jealousy, envy? The pain of seeing someone suffering? Not wanting that person to suffer or not wanting to feel that pain. In emotional pain, what we call emotional pain, isn't there always a memory involved, thought from memory or feelings from memory? about what was and what should be or could be. Thoughts always revolving around me, my ways, my possessions, my future, or my past, or the past of those I feel closely identified with. What will happen to me? What will happen to them in the future based on what I know from the past? And the pain that those thoughts evoke throughout the organism. There's not just such a thing as mental pain. Pain may be a headache, but pain is felt throughout the organism, can be felt. One may be numb to it. Whole organism responds to one anxious thought, or one angry thought, one jealous thought, one thought of self-pity, and the whole organism responds instantly. One may have gotten used to immediately dulling oneself or turning off the receptors, not feeling it, but it doesn't mean that it isn't triggered. And then she's asking, where does suffering start? Well, isn't it the same as what was written about before? The one who suffers from this emotional pain. The same one who brought it into being. The thought of me and mine. And not wanting that pain that has already been set into motion. If one is merely with the discomfort that has already been set into motion by an angry or fearful thought, being with that pain, but the abating of the thoughts that feed it, then that pain will abate again. It will peter out. There's no further thought of, why should I suffer this emotional pain? That's more pain, more separation, and more feeding into the whole conflict expressed physically in discomfort. So the question comes up whether there can be the witnessing, we'll use this word carefully, the witnessing of pain within or without, to the fullest, in depth, feeling it, not separating from it. Not separating from it. Not mine or yours. No thought about that. And therefore just precisely, fully what is going on. Being one with that stream, not being one with it, being that stream of happening. With no reaction to it. She writes here that in that non-separation there is the arising of compassion, which is not a reaction. Compassion is not reacting to or against. It arises when there is no reaction, no opposition to what is actually happening, within or without. Which, if not seen with any possessive or separating thoughts, are not two different happenings. we'll go on to some portions of this book by Etty Hillesum. Since we will read quite a bit of it, this tape for copyright reasons may not be for sale. It's being taped, so if somebody wants to listen to it, they can listen to it here. The book is called Letters from Westerbrook, Pantheon Books, New York. Actually, the first section was not written in Westerbork. Westerbork was a transitional camp created by the Germans occupying Holland, in which Jews from all over Holland, but also from other European countries, were gathered and kept, detained until transported to Poland for extermination. That was not ever clear to the people who were there. What would happen to them on those transports was kept quite a tight secret. Etty was a member of the Jewish Council, which helped administrate that camp, and was also involved in helping people there in the hospitals, just whatever she saw needed attending to. She herself was of very frail health, and got ill and was allowed to go to Amsterdam and be treated by a physician there. And this section is written in Amsterdam during her reconvalescence. She's writing to two sisters because one of the friends in the camp asked her to please write a letter to these people describing Westerbork to them. It was summer when I came here for the first time. Up till then, all I'd known about Drenthe was that it had a lot of megalithic tombs. And then suddenly there was a village of wooden barracks set between heath and sky, with a glaringly yellow lupin field in the middle and barbed wire all around. And there were human lives as well, thick as flies. To be honest, I had never realized that refugees from Germany had already been held at Drenthe Heath for 4 years in which I had been busy taking up collections for Spanish and Chinese children. During the first few days, I walked around it as if through the pages of a history book. I met people who had been in Buchenwald and Dachau at a time when to us these were only distant, threatening sounds. I met people who traveled all around the world on that ship without being allowed to disembark at any port. You must have heard of that. The papers were full of it. I've seen snapshots of little children who are probably now growing up in some unknown corner of this earth. Who knows whether they will ever even recognize their parents, if they ever see them again. In short, one had the feeling of seeing in tangible form a small part of the Jewish predicament of the last 10 years. And we had thought there was nothing at Drenthe except megalithic tombs. It was enough to take your breath away. In the summer of 1942, it seems years ago, so much more has happened in a few months than can be told in a few pages. This small settlement was turned upside down and shaken to the marrow. With horror, the old camp inmates witnessed the mass deportation of Jews from Holland to Eastern Europe. From the very beginning, they had to make their own considerable contribution in terms of human lives when the quota of, quote, voluntary workers, unquote, was not completely filled. One summer evening I sat eating red cabbage at the edge of the yellow lupin field that stretched from our dining hut to the delousing station, and with sudden inspiration I said, one ought to write a chronicle of Westerbork. An older man to my left, also eating red cabbage, answered, yes, but to do that you'd have to be a great poet. He's right, it would take a great poet. Little journalistic pieces won't do. The whole of Europe is gradually being turned into one great prison camp. The whole of Europe will undergo the same bitter experience. To simply record the bare facts of families torn apart, of possessions plundered and liberties forfeited, would soon become monotonous. Nor is it possible to pen picturesque accounts of barbed wire and vegetable swill to show outsiders what it's like. Besides, I wonder how many outsiders will be left if history continues along the paths it has taken. There you are. I could tell right away that nothing would come from my report on Westerbork. The first attempt has got me bogged down in generalities. On the whole, a person more or less contemplative by nature isn't really suited to describe a specific place or event. One discovers that the basic materials of life are the same everywhere, and that one can live one's life with meaning, or else one can die in any spot on this earth. The Big Dipper looks down on some distant hamlet just as reliably as it does on a great city at the hub of a nation, or as it does on a coal mine in Silesia. So that's all right with the world. So that all is right with the world. All I really want to say is this: I'm no poet, and I'm rather at my wits' end to know how to honor my promise to Kay. That's the man who asked to do this writing. For although the name Westerbork is highly charged for us and will reverberate in our ears for the rest of our lives, I don't know precisely what I can say about it. Life there is so eventful, although many may consider it deadly boring. Something is skipped here. If I understand it correctly, this place, now a focus of Jewish suffering, lay deserted and empty for just 4 years ago, and the spirit of the Department of Justice hovered over the heath. There wasn't a butterfly to be seen here, not a flower, not even a worm, the first German inmates told me emphatically. And now, let me give you a rough idea from the inventory. We have an orphanage, a synagogue, a small mortuary, a shoe repair factory under construction. I've heard talk of a madhouse being built, and my latest information is that the expanding hospital barracks complex already has 1,000 beds. The 2-person jail that stands like something out of an operetta in one corner of the camp is apparently no longer large enough, for they plan to build a bigger one. It must sound strange to you, a prison within a prison. We have a Dutch commandant and a German one. The first is taller, but the second has more of a say. We are told, moreover, that he likes music and that he's a gentleman. I'm no judge, although I must say that for a gentleman he certainly has a somewhat peculiar job. There is a hall with a stage where, in the glorious past, when the word transport had not yet been heard, a rather faltering Shakespeare production was once put on. At the moment, people sit at typewriters on the same stage. There is mud, so much mud, that somewhere between your ribs you need to have a great deal of inner sunshine if you don't want to become the psychological victim of it all. The physical effects, such as broken shoes and wet feet, you will certainly understand. Although the camp buildings are all one story, you can hear as many accents as if the Tower of Babel had been erected in our midst. Bavaria and Groningen, Saxony and Limburg, The Hague and East Friesland. You can hear German with a Polish accent and German with a Russian accent. You find all sorts of dialects from Holland and Berlin, all in an area of half a kilometer square. The barbed wire is more a question of attitude. Us behind barbed wire, an indestructible old gentleman once said with a melancholy wave of his hand, they are the ones who live behind barbed wire. And he pointed to the tall villas that stand like sentries on the other side of the fence. If the barbed wire just encircled the camp, then at least you would know where you were. But these 20th century wires meander about inside the camp too, around the barracks and in between, in a labyrinthine and unfathomable network. Now and then you come across people with scratches on their faces or hands. There are watchtowers at the four corners of our wooden village, each a windswept platform on four tall posts. A man with a helmet and a gun stands outlined against the changing skies. In the evening, one sometimes hears a shot echo across the heath, as it did once when the blind man stumbled too close to the barbed wire. Finding something to say about Westerbork is also difficult because of its ambiguous character. On the one hand, it is a stable community in the making, a forced one to be sure, yet with all the characteristics of a human society. And on the other hand, it is a camp for a people in transit, great waves of human beings constantly washed in from the cities and provinces, from rest homes, prisons, and other prison camps, from all the nooks and crannies of the Netherlands, only to be deported a few days later to meet their unknown destiny. You can imagine how dreadfully crowded it is in half a square kilometer. Naturally, few follow the example of the man who packed his rucksack and went on transport on his own account. When asked why, he said that he wanted the freedom to decide to go when he wanted to go. It reminds me of the Roman judge who said to a martyr, "Do you know that I have the power to have you killed?" And the martyr answered, "Yes, but I have the power of letting myself be killed." Anyway, it's terribly crowded in Westerbork, as when too many drowning people cling to the last bit of flotsam after a ship has sunk. People would rather spend the winter behind barbed wire in Holland's poorest province than be dragged away to unknown parts and unknown destinies deep within Europe, from where only a few indistinct sounds have come back to the rest of us. But the quota must be filled, so must the train which comes to fetch its load with mathematical regularity. You cannot keep everyone back as being indispensable to the camp or too sick for transport, although you try it with a great many. You sometimes think it would be simpler to put yourself on the transport than have to witness the fear and despair of the thousands upon thousands of men, women, children, infants, invalids, the feeble-minded, the sick, and the aged, who pass through our helping hands in an almost uninterrupted flow. My fountain pen cannot form words strong enough to convey even the remotest picture of these transports. From the outside, the impression is of bleak monotony, yet every transport is different and has its own atmosphere. When the first transport passed through our hands, there was a moment when I thought I would never again laugh and be happy, that I had changed suddenly into another, older person cut off from all former friends. But on walking through the crowded camp, I realized again that where there are people, there is life. Life in all its thousands of nuances, with a smile and a tear, to put it in popular terms. It made a great difference whether people arrived prepared with well-filled rucksacks or had been suddenly dragged out of their houses or swept up from the streets. In the end, we saw only the last. After the first of the police roundups, when people arrived in slippers and underclothes, the whole of Westerbork, in a single horrified and heroic gesture, stripped to the skin. And we've tried, with the close cooperation of people on the outside, to make sure that those who leave are equipped as well as possible. But if we remember all those who went to face the winter in Eastern Europe without any clothes, if we remember the single thin blanket that was sometimes all we were able to dole out in the night, a few hours before departure. The slum dwellers arrived from the cities, displaying their poverty and neglect in the bare barracks. Aghast, many of us asked ourselves, what sort of democracy did we really have? The people from Rotterdam were in a class by themselves, hardened by the bombing raids. We don't frighten easily anymore, you often heard them say. If we've survived all that, we'll survive this too. And a few days later, they marched singing to the train. But it was midsummer then, and they were no old people yet, or invalids on stretchers bringing up the rear. The Jews from Heerlen and Maastricht and thereabouts came telling stories that reverberated with the great send-off the province of Limburg had given them. One felt that morally they could live on it for a long time. The Catholics have promised to pray for us, and they are better at that than we are, said one of them. Apparently it was the footnote says Limburg was a Catholic area which had been very kind to the people that had been rounded up and sent away. People came with all their rivalries. The Jews from Haarlem said somewhat loftily and acidly, those Amsterdammers have a grim sense of humor. There were children who would not accept the sandwich before their parents had had one. There was a remarkable day when the Jewish Catholics, or Catholic Jews, whichever you want to call them, arrived, nuns and priests wearing the yellow star on their habits. I remember 2 young novices, twins, with identical beautiful dark ghetto faces and serene childish eyes peering out from under their skull caps. They said with mild surprise that they had been fetched at 4:30 from morning mass, and that they had eaten red cabbage in Amersfoort. There was a priest, still fairly young, who had not left his monastery for 15 years. He was out in the world for the first time, in quotation marks. And I stood next to him for a while, following his eyes as they wandered peacefully around the barracks where the newcomers were being received. The others, shaven, beaten, maltreated, who poured in along with the Catholics that day, stumbled about the wooden hut with movements that were still unsteady and stretched out their hands toward the bread, of which there was not enough. A young Jew stood very still next to us. His jacket was much too loose, but a grin broke through his stubby black beard when he said, "They tried to smash the wall of the prison with my head, but my head was harder than the wall." Among all the shaved heads, it was strange to see the white turbaned women who had just been treated in the delousing barracks and who went about now looking distressed and humiliated. Children dozed off on the dusty plank floor. Others played tag among the adults. 2 little ones floundered helplessly around the heavy body of a woman lying unconscious in a corner. They didn't understand why their mother just lay there without answering them. A gray-haired old gentleman, straight as an arrow and with a clear-cut aristocratic profile, stared at the whole infernal canvas and repeated over and over to himself, "A terrible day, a terrible day." And among all this, the unremitting clatter of a battery of typewriters, the machine gun fire of bureaucracy. Through the many little window panes, one can see other wooden barracks, barbed wire, and a blasted heath. I looked at the priest who was now back in the world again. And what do you think of the world now? I asked. But his gaze remained unwavering and friendly above the brown habit, as if everything he saw was known and familiar from long ago. The same evening, a man later told me, he saw some priests walking one behind the other in the dusk between two dark barracks. They were saying their rosaries as imperturbably as if they had just finished Vesper at the monastery. And isn't it true that one can pray anywhere, in a wooden barracks just as well as in a stone monastery, or indeed anywhere on this earth where God in these troubled times feels like casting his likeness? For those who have been granted the nerve-shattering privilege of being allowed to stay in Westerbork until further notice, there is the great moral danger of becoming blunted and hardened. The human suffering that we have seen during the last 6 months and still see daily is more than anyone can be expected to comprehend in half a year. No wonder we hear on all sides every day, in every pitch of voice, we don't want to think, we don't want to feel, we want to forget as soon as possible. It seems to me that this is a very great danger. True, things happen here that in the past our reason would not have judged possible. But perhaps we have faculties other than reason in us, faculties that in the past we didn't know we had, but that possess the ability to grapple with the incomprehensible. I believe that for every event, man has a faculty that helps him deal with it. If we were to save only our bodies and nothing more from the camps all over the world, that would not be enough. What matters is not whether we preserve our lives at any cost, but how we preserve them. I sometimes think that every new situation, good or bad, can enrich us with new insights. But if we abandon the hard facts that we are forced to face, if we give them no shelter in our heads and hearts, do not allow them to settle and change into impulses through which we can grow and from which we can draw meaning, then we're not a viable generation. It is not easy, and no doubt less easy for us Jews than for anyone else. Yet if we have nothing to offer a desolate post-war world but our bodies saved at any cost, if we fail to draw new meaning from the deep wells of our distress and despair, then it will not be enough. New thoughts will have to radiate outward from the camps themselves. New insights, spreading lucidity, will have to cross the barbed wire enclosing us and join with the insights that people outside will have to earn just as bloodily in circumstances that are slowly becoming almost as difficult. And perhaps, on the common basis of an honest search for some way to understand these dark events, wrecked lives may yet take a tentative step forward. That's why it seemed such a great danger to me when all around one could hear, we don't want to think, we don't want to feel, it's best to shut your eyes to all this misery. As if suffering in whatever form and however it may come to us were not also part of human existence. I see I have strayed far beyond your friend Kay's innocuous request. After all, I was to tell you something about life in Westerbork, not about my own views. I couldn't help it. They just slipped out. Later on, even if I went on for pages, I still couldn't convey any idea of the shuffling and the stumbling and the falling down, the need for help, along with the childish questions. You can't do much with words. A helping hand on the shoulder is sometimes too heavy. Oh no, these old people, they need a chapter to themselves. She just talked about old people. Their helpless gestures and exhausted faces crowd many a sleepless night. In a few months, the population has swelled from 1,000 to roughly 10,000. The greatest influx dates from the awful days of October, when after a massive Jew hunt throughout the Netherlands, Westerbork was swept up by a flood, human flood, that threatened to engulf it. Hence, this is not exactly an organically evolved community with its own even rhythms. Yet, and this is what takes the breath away, you can find every attitude here, every class, every ism, conflict, and current of society. And the area still remains only half a kilometer square. In retrospect, is it really so surprising? Since every individual carries deep in his inner being the trend, the part of society, the cultural level he represents. But what always strikes one anew is that even at a time of shared distress, these distinctions are maintained. One day in the mud between two big barracks, I met a girl who told me she had ended up in Westerbork by chance. This is a typical phenomenon. Everyone views his own case as an unfortunate accident. We have not yet gained a common sense of history. But to come back to the girl, she told me a pathetic tale of little packages that failed to arrive and of a pair of lost shoes. And then her face brightened and she said, "But we have been lucky with people. Our barracks is full of the best people." Do you know what they call it? De Bocht van de Herengracht, which is the area where the fancy people lived, back home. Confounded, I looked from her worn-out shoes to her made-up face and did not know whether to laugh or to cry. Of all the shortages in Westerbork concentration camp, the shortage of space is surely the worst. About 2,500 of the more than 10,000 people are housed in 215 small huts, which used to be the main part of the camp and which held one family each in pre-transport times. Now comes a description. People can get this book from the library, read for themselves. All these great human warehouses have been put up in precisely the same manner in the middle of the mud and have been furnished in the same, let us say, austere style. But the remarkable thing is that while a trip through one barracks may make you feel you are in a squalid slum, another will give the impression of a solid middle-class district. In fact, every bunk and every rough wooden table seems to radiate its own atmosphere. I know of a table in one of the barracks where a candle burns in a glass lantern every evening. Some 8 people usually sit around it, and it's called the Bohemian Corner. When you go on a few steps to the next table, also with 8 people sitting around it, the only difference may be that it holds a couple of dirty pans instead of a candle, but it is like an entirely different world. Like circumstances do not yet seem to produce like people. Leading lights from the cultural and political circles in the big cities have also been stranded on this barren stretch of heath, 500 by 600 meters. With one mighty convulsion, all their scenery has collapsed about them, and now they stand around a little hesitantly and awkwardly on this drafty, open stage called Westerbork. These figures, wrenched from their context, still carry with them the restless atmosphere of a society more complicated than the one we have here. They walk along the thin barbed wire fence. Their silhouettes move, life-sized and exposed, across the great stretch of sky. You cannot imagine it. Their armor of position, esteem, and property has collapsed. And now they stand in the last shreds of their humanity. They exist in an empty space, bounded by earth and sky, which they must fill with whatever they can find within them. There is nothing else. One suddenly realizes that it is not enough to be an able politician or a talented artist. In the most extreme distress, life demands quite other things. Yes, it is true, our ultimate human values are being put to the test. Perhaps I have persuaded you with my chatter that I have now told you something about Westerbork. But when I let Westerbork rise up in my mind's eye in all its facets and with all its spiritual and material needs, I can see that success has eluded me. Furthermore, this is a very one-sided story. I could have told quite another one, filled with hatred and bitterness and rebellion. But rebellion born only when distress begins to affect one personally is no real rebellion and can never bear fruit. And the absence of hatred in no way implies the absence of moral indignation. I know that those who hate have good reasons to do so, but why should we always have to choose the cheapest and easiest way? It has been brought home forcibly to me here how every atom of hatred added to the world makes it an even more inhospitable place. And I also believe, childishly perhaps, but stubbornly, that the earth will become more habitable again only through the love that the Jew Paul described to the citizens of Corinth in the 13th chapter of his first letter. The more I think about it, the worse it seems that I have left you without news for so long. I wanted to write as soon as I got back here to you and to Rosenberg and Hausmann. You were always so kind and hospitable. I felt so much at home with you. Hausmann's potato soup certainly lives as a culinary high point in my memory, and the Hanukkah lights and the big barracks are an even more precious memory because I was there with you. The reason I haven't managed to write is probably that I felt rather ill, quite apart from being downcast when the doctor told me I would have to rest for another 5 weeks. But my good humor is gradually creeping back. She's back in Westerbork. People live an episodic life here. I have a quarter of an hour to spare, so another few words. Yes, really it's true. There are compassionate laws in nature, if only we can keep a feeling for their rhythm. I notice that afresh each time in myself. When I am at the limit of despair, unable, I'm sure to go on, suddenly the balance shifts over to the other side and I can laugh and take life as it comes. After feeling really low for ages, you can suddenly rise to high above earthly misery. that you feel lighter and more liberated than ever before in your life. I am now very well again, but for a few days I was quite desperate. Equilibrium is restored time and again. Ah, children, we live in a strange world. Okay, she's writing to a friend, I think, who published her, with whom she left her earlier diary. Maria, hello, 10,000 have passed through this place, the clothed and the naked, the old and the young, the sick and the healthy, and I'm left to live and work and stay cheerful. It will be my parents' turn to leave soon, if by some miracle not this week, then certainly one of the next. And I must learn to accept this as well. Misha insists on going along with them. Misha is her brother, who was a child prodigy pianist. He could have been exempted and sent to a detainment camp for culturally valuable people who were exempted for the time being, but he refused. Unless his parents could come along, his parents were not allowed to go there. Misha insists on going along with them, and it seems to me that he probably should. If he has to watch our parents leave this place, it would totally unhinge him. I shan't go, I just can't. It's easier to pray for someone from a distance than to see him suffer by your side. It is not fear of Poland that keeps me from going along with my parents, but fear of seeing them suffer. And that too is cowardice. This is something people refuse to admit to themselves. At a given point, you can no longer do, but can only be and accept. And although that is something I learned a long time ago, I also know that one can only accept for oneself and not for others. And that's what's so desperately difficult for me here. Mother and Misha still want to do, in quotation marks, to turn the whole world upside down, but I know we can't do anything about it. I've never been able to do, in quotation marks, anything. I can only let things take their course and, if need be, suffer. This is where my strength lies, and it is great strength indeed, but for myself, not for others. Mother and father have definitely been turned down for Barneveld. We heard the news yesterday. They were also told to be ready to leave here on next Tuesday's transport. Misha wanted to rush straight to the commandant and call him a murderer. We'll have to watch him carefully. Outwardly, father appears very calm, but he would have gone to pieces in a matter of days in these vast barracks if I hadn't been able to have him taken to the hospital, which he's gradually coming to find just as intolerable. He's really at his wit's end, though he tries not to show it. My prayers, too, aren't going quite right. I know you can pray God to give people the strength to bear whatever comes, but I keep repeating the same prayer, God, make it as short as possible. And as a result, I'm paralyzed. I would like to pack their cases with the best things I can lay my hands on, but I know perfectly well that they will be stripped of everything. About that we have been left in no doubt, so why bother? I have a good friend here. Last week he was told to keep himself in readiness for transport. When I went to see him, he stood straight as an arrow, face calm, rucksack packed beside his bed. We didn't mention his leaving, but he did read me various things he had written, and we talked a little philosophy. We didn't make things hard for each other with grief about having to say goodbye. We laughed and said we would see each other soon. We were both able to bear our lot. And that's what's so desperate about this place. Most people are not able to bear their lot, and they load it onto the shoulders of others. And that burden is more likely to break one than one's own. Yes, I feel perfectly able to bear my lot, but not that of my parents. This is the last letter I'll be allowed to write for a while. This afternoon our identity cards were taken away, and we became official camp inmates. so you'll have to have a little patience waiting for news from me. Perhaps I will be able to smuggle a letter out now and then. Bye, Maria, dear friend. Actually, as it turned out, she was sent on the same transport as her parents. There's one more paragraph here. Many feel that their love of mankind languishes at Westerbork because it receives no nourishment, meaning that people here don't give you much occasion to love them. Quote, the mass is a hideous monster. Individuals are pitiful, unquote, someone said. But I keep discovering that there is no causal connection between people's behavior and the love you feel for them. Love for one's fellow man is like an elemental glow that sustains you. The fellow man himself has hardly anything to do with it. Oh, Maria, it's a little bit bare of love here, and I myself feel so inexpressibly rich I cannot explain it. In your reply, please don't let it slip that you received this letter outside my writing day. There is strict censorship on incoming mail at the moment. Love to you all, Etty. We will end here for today.